it's Greg Hurrell here with another Vim screencast. And the reason I'm making this one is because a number of people have asked me if I've tried cock. And I'm actually going to sidestep that question because I don't think cock is actually the interesting thing here. Cock is a plugin for Vim which provides a number of language-aware editor features to Vim. And the reason why I think cock isn't actually the interesting thing is because it is but one of a range of tools that can provide that functionality. And the thing that actually really is interesting that all these tools are built on is a thing called the language server protocol. So just to give a super quick rundown on cock, it has an unfortunate name, obviously. The full name is Conquer of Completion, but it goes by the shorthand of cock. And I don't want to make fun of the name because this is a project that somebody's working very hard on, and it, that work I think deserves respect. And a lot of people love the plugin, a lot of people use it, and I did actually try it because someone told me that it looked like it was being actively developed and that it was faster than what I had been using, which was Deoplete. I tried it and found I couldn't really tell the difference, and so I dropped it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, as I say. But a lot of people love this, and it seems to be like a batteries included kind of thing, where if you install this, you get into this whole ecosystem of custom cock functionality, as you can see here. But as I said, I don't really want to talk about this plugin concretely. I want to talk more about the abstract, which is that there are other plugins out there that use the language server protocol. So just to mention a couple briefly, there's Ale, which probably didn't support the language server protocol when it first came out. I think its major selling point was that it could run lints and syntax checks asynchronously. And the language server stuff I think probably came along later as that particular ecosystem has matured. I never used Ale. And I never used Syntactic, which was the synchronous predecessor to this one. What I do use though is this one, Language Client NeoVim, which does less than the others. So the description here you'll see is much more modest. It really just provides support for the so-called language server protocol. So it doesn't provide completion even, which means I'm still using Deoplete for completion. But they do work well together. So what is this language server protocol thing? Well, if you go to langserver.org, you'll get a rundown of it. But the basic idea is that there are lots of programming languages out there and there are a lot of editors, and we don't really want to have to reinvent the wheel and develop sophisticated language-related features in every single editor. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just embed that knowledge in a standalone server, which would be a language server, and then via a well-defined protocol, any editor that wants to talk to any language server can just do that using the protocol. And so if you look here, you'll see a big list of languages and the kind of features that have been implemented in the main repositories of those respective language servers. And as you can see, this is the kind of things it can do, like code completion and providing information on hover, so to speak, and diagnostics and whatnot. So if you don't want to go any further in this screencast, the takeaway message that I want you to receive is that this stuff is pretty useful, and all you need to do is find one of the plugins that gives you access into the language server ecosystem and then go from there. And it can enable some interesting things in your Vim workflow. So I'm going to show you the iTerm 2 update, and then I'm going to show you language server in practice. So I'm in a JavaScript project, and I'm just going to open a file. I feel like I had a file that I was working on. What was it called? That's the one. So I was working on this file today. This is a JavaScript file, and the kind of things that I get from language server integration are obviously code completion. So I can, it's giving me, well, this is actually a good example because you can see that it's basing this potential completion of path on words that are in the buffer, but it also offers me functions that it happens to know about. So this is a language-aware thing. It's not just a dumb textual match. And the other thing that you would have seen in other screencasts of mine is that if I type a syntax error or any other kind of problematic thing, I'm going to get inline feedback immediately. So you can see there, I'm not even going to say what you can see because you can see it, right? And so that's nice to get instant feedback, which doesn't interrupt your editing. So, I can continue typing and the feedback just moves around, but it never gets in the way of what I actually want to do, which is writing code. And one interesting thing to note about this is just JavaScript, which is untyped. This is not a TypeScript or a Flow annotated project, but I still get those language-aware code completion features. So that's pretty handy. If this were a TypeScript file, I would get more information. So for example, just say I hit my hover key here, which is Shift-K. It tells me that path is of type any. But if this were a TypeScript project, it would show me more information, for example, about functions that I might hover over. So that's what the language server brings. Now I just want to quickly show you how I set up my particular instantiation of the language server. So let's go to my vimrc where I set most of this up, and language client. So the language client is mostly set up by, there we go, language client, setting global variables. So I'll put a link to my .files if you want to peruse this, but the basic idea of all this stuff in my vimrc is first of all to set some of these globals so that things like the inline diagnostics look good, but also teach the plugin how to map a particular kind of source code to a particular language server, because what I just showed you was a JavaScript file, but you could have this set up for a Camel or Reason or any other number of languages that have language server implementations. So the real meat of this configuration here is this so-called language server commands variable here, which as you can see I'm initializing to an empty object. And then, depending on what executables I have in the path, I'm going to configure that server commands object in a certain way. So here you can see that if you run npm install JavaScript TypeScript lang server, which is, in my experience, the most reliable TypeScript and JavaScript language server implementation, then it will put this executable on your system. And if that executable exists on the system, then we assign it to a variable. We basically remember the fact that we've seen it. Likewise, I have a few other things where I can set an environment variable, and if I have that, then I will append some debugging arguments, but I never need to set that. I pretty much put this debug stuff in when I first configured it, and then haven't really needed to use it since. Another example would be down here, if the flow executable is on the system, then same thing. We basically record the fact that we know where the language server implementation for flow is. And finally, we look at TypeScript file types. I've got a few compound file types here, because in my FT detect setup, I've made it so that I can detect multiple file types simultaneously. For example, a file that is simultaneously TypeScript but is also a test file or jest, and so on. And likewise for JavaScript. So I have those different file types set up. And then basically for each of the TypeScript file types, I'm going to assign it to whatever the TypeScript language server is. The one I showed you above is the one that I use, but you can also see here, if you look, there's one that you can get by npm install TypeScript language server. And once again, if that executable exists, we can use that. But I didn't really need to try that one too deeply, because the first one that I tried was good enough, I think. And then finally, you see this thing where, depending on whether or not we found an executable, we actually set up the server commands for these specific file types. You can see I'm doing the same with a camel. I also set it up to put so-called diagnostics, which could be things like lint errors, in the location list, because the default would be to go to the quick fix list, but I use the quick fix list very heavily, and I don't want it getting blown away every time there's some kind of diagnostic information for a particular file type. Whereas the location list works pretty well for that. And finally, I think I've got some more config in an after plugin file, but nothing too extreme here. You'll see here that in reason files, I've defined the format expression so that when I hit GQ, it will use reformat, which is the bundled formatting tool that comes with Reason. And we've got a binding for formatting the entire buffer, a binding for jumping to definition, and a binding for hover, which is what I hit before when I showed you the documentation for the path variable. Now, if I try to hit this key binding in a file type that doesn't have a language server, like this one, which is a Vim file type, it's just not going to do anything, because it says, sorry, no help for language client. And that is really all. So I would encourage you to pick one of these implementations, take it for a spin, and depending on what language you use, your mileage may vary, but it does work really well in the whole JavaScript and TypeScript ecosystem. And thanks for listening. If you want to hear more of this stuff in the future, hit the subscribe button and I'll be back with more.